Imagine a land where women's voices shaped markets, guided families, and upheld the heartbeat of society. A land where strength was not only found in warriors with spears, but in the mothers, wives, and sisters who tilled the soil, traded in bustling markets, and passed down wisdom through song and story. This was eastern Nigeria in the 1920s, Igbo and Ibibio country, alive with colour, rhythm, and tradition. In the years after Britain imposed its rule over Nigeria, life for women in the East was vibrant yet burdened. Markets bustled every 5 days as women, draped in flowing wrappers and beads, traded palm oil, yams, fish, and handmade cloth. These markets were not just economic centres, they were social hubs, places where women made decisions that shaped their communities. But beyond the lively chatter of trade, a shadow loomed. The British had introduced indirect rule, appointing warrant chiefs to govern. These chiefs were often handpicked, sometimes men with no true lineage or respect among their people. For societies where decisions were made collectively, where women had their own councils and wielded powerful voices, this was an insult. Worse still, whispers spread that the colonial government intended to extend taxation to women. For men, taxes were already heavy and resented. For women, whose trading sustained families, this was seen as an attack not only on livelihood but on dignity itself. Picture the village square at dusk. The fires crackle as women gather, their voices hushed yet sharp. A mother of 6 clutches her wrapper tight as she tells the others. They say the white man will count us. After the counting, he will tax us like he taxes our husbands. Is this justice? Gasps ripple through the crowd. An elder woman, beads glistening against her neck, shakes her head. We cannot allow this. If we stay silent, they will silence us forever. The women murmur in agreement. Some slap their thighs, others clap their hands in a rhythm of protest. It is in these twilight gatherings that the seeds of resistance were sown. To the colonial officials, these women were mere market traders. But in truth, they carried with them centuries of political tradition. Among the Igbo, when injustice arose, women practiced sitting on a man, a form of collective protest where women would surround a man's compound, singing, dancing, and mocking until he yielded to justice. It was non-violent, but powerful. Shame, after all, could topple a leader as effectively as a sword. Now, these same tactics would soon be turned against the mighty British Empire. By late 1929, meetings multiplied. Messages were carried from village to village, not in secret letters but in songs, chants, and market conversations. Palm fronds became symbols of unity, passed hand to hand as women pledged to stand together. Imagine the sight. Hundreds of women, their feet beating the earth, their voices rising in chorus. We will not be counted. We will not be taxed. We are the mothers of this land. Their chants echoed through farmlands and marketplaces. The colonial warrant chiefs, uneasy in their authority, felt the pressure mounting. To the British officials, it was mere restlessness. But to those who lived among the people, the air was heavy with something undeniable. A storm was coming. In the town of Oloko, one woman, Nwanyaruwa, a widow, would soon ignite the spark that turned discontent into full rebellion. But before her voice thundered into history, the stage had already been set. The women of eastern Nigeria were not passive victims of colonial oppression. They were watchful, united, and determined. Their markets had given them power. Their traditions had given them courage. And their motherhood had given them a cause greater than themselves. The drums of discontent were beating louder now. And soon, the world would hear them. Every revolution begins with a spark. For the women of eastern Nigeria, that spark came from an ordinary exchange. Sharp words that carried the weight of centuries. It was the moment when whispers of discontent became the roar of resistance. It was December 1929. The town of Oloko, in present-day Abia State, was alive with its 5-day market. Women laid out their goods, yam heaps, calabashes of palm oil, dried fish, and woven cloth. The air smelled of roasted maize and red earth, while voices rose and fell in haggling tones. Among them was Nwanyaruwa, a widow who had endured much. Her husband was gone, yet she sustained her family through trade. Like many women, she had heard the rumors. The British intended to count women, just as they had counted men before taxing them. And that morning, Those rumors became her reality. A colonial warrant chief, Okugo, ordered the census in his jurisdiction. His messengers went from home to home, tallying people. When they approached Nwanyaruwa, she refused. The exchange was simple, but thunderous. Okugo's man, woman, prepare yourself to be counted. Nwanyaruwa, angrily count me? Do you tax your mothers? Do you tax your wives? I will not be counted. The market gasped. Women abandoned their stalls, rushing toward her. Did you hear? They want to tax us. They want to count us like cattle. Her defiance lit the spark. Within hours, the market square was filled with hundreds of women, ululating, clapping, and chanting in unison. Their voices shook the air. Their bare feet stamped the dust into rising clouds. News of the confrontation traveled like wildfire. Traders carried it to neighboring villages, their words urgent. Sisters, rise. The white man seeks to tax us. Aloko has refused. Join us. From Aba to Bende, from Oweri to Ikot Ikpan, the call rang out. By the end of the week, thousands of women had abandoned their farms and markets to march in solidarity. Imagine the roads of Igboland, long lines of women, some carrying palm fronds as a sign of unity, others with babies tied to their backs. They sang as they walked, their songs half prayer, half battle cry. We are mothers. We are life. We will not be broken by tax or knife. To the colonial officials, this sudden eruption of protest was baffling. In their eyes, women were invisible in politics. But in reality, these women had centuries of tradition behind them. One district officer reported in disbelief. They are not armed with spears or guns, yet they march in their thousands. Their weapon is their voice. But voices, when united, can be more dangerous than bullets. In Aloko, the women surrounded Chief Okugo's compound. They sang songs mocking his greed and betrayal. They danced through the night, stamping, clapping, rattling gourds, their voices rising higher with every hour. This was not chaos, it was organized defiance, the ancient practice of sitting on a man, now reborn against colonial authority. Okugo, terrified, sent messages pleading for the women to disperse. But they only laughed, shouting, "We are the mothers of the land. Without us, you have no people. We will not move until justice is done." What began with Nwanyaruwa in Aloko became an inferno across the east. By mid-December, tens of thousands of women had joined the uprising. They blocked roads, halted trains, and surrounded colonial offices. They sang against taxation, against corruption, against the oppression of warrant chiefs who ruled without consent. The British had never seen anything like it. This was no scattered rebellion of men with machetes. This was the collective fury of women, united across clans, across dialects, across faiths. And as their numbers grew, so too did the tension. For every song, the colonial government heard a threat. For every march, they saw rebellion. And soon, fear would drive them to a brutal response. But in that moment, in the market town of Aloko, the spark had been lit. One widow, one voice, had become thousands. The women who had once been dismissed as mere traders now stood as warriors of justice, their voices echoing through villages like war drums. The British Empire had underestimated them. And soon, the world would learn the cost of that mistake. What began as a spark in Aloko became a wildfire that consumed an entire region. By mid-December 1929, the Women's War was no longer a whisper of protest. It was a storm roaring across Igboland, Aba at its center. The roads leading to Aba town filled with women from every direction. Farmers left their hoes in the soil. Traders abandoned their stalls. Mothers strapped infants to their backs, their steps steady as their songs rose to the heavens. Eyewitnesses recalled. They came like rivers, flowing into Aba, filling the town with voices, clapping, stamping, and song. There were thousands of them, more than the eyes could count. Their numbers swelled. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. A movement that had begun in one small market had now become the greatest mass protest the British had faced in Africa. The women were not wild mobs, but organized voices of justice. At Aba, they delivered clear demands. A abolish the idea of women's taxation. A curb the powers of warrant chiefs, who extorted and abused the people. A respect the traditions of women's councils, long ignored under colonial rule. They sang in unison, their words like fire. We are mothers. We are traders. Without us there is no life. We will not pay your tax. We will not bow to your knife. The protests were not random. They followed the old Igbo practice of sitting on a man, gathering at the home or office of an offender, singing mocking songs, clapping, and dancing until he relented. Now, the women used this cultural weapon against colonial officers and chiefs. They marched to offices, surrounded compounds, pounded the air with rattles and gourds, and refused to disperse. At our bar, they besieged the native court building, shutting down colonial justice. They blocked roads, overturned telegraph poles, and cut off lines of communication. Trains could not pass. Messengers could not travel. The empire, for the first time, felt powerless before unarmed women. District officers sent frantic reports. They are in their thousands, and they come with such discipline. They mock authority. They show no fear. This is not disorder, it is war. But fear breeds violence. On December 17, 1929, colonial troops were ordered to suppress the women in our bar. Armed soldiers stood at the courthouse as the women approached, singing and clapping. The officers shouted warnings, but the women refused to move. One raised her hand and declared, "We are not slaves. We are not animals. We are mothers of the land, and we will not leave until justice is given." The silence that followed was broken by the crack of rifles. Gunfire tore through the crowd. Screams pierced the air as women fell. Traders, mothers, daughters, blood staining the dust. Panic spread, yet even in chaos, many women did not flee. They stood their ground, wailing, ululating, their voices rising above the gunfire. An eyewitness later said, "They killed them, yet the women sang. They shot into our bodies, but we would not bow." Dozens were killed that day in our bar, but instead of breaking the movement, the killings hardened it. News of the massacre spread like lightning. From Owari to Umwaria, from Bende to Ikot Ikpan, women rose in fury. They set fire to native courts, tore down colonial records, and destroyed symbols of oppression. At Umwaria, a British officer watched in disbelief as thousands of women marched with palm fronds and war songs, their voices shaking the very earth. "This is no riot," he wrote. "It is a rebellion of women." The empire could not contain them. Villages emptied as women joined the marches, swelling the numbers into tens of thousands. They did not carry guns, yet their courage turned them into an unstoppable army. For 2 weeks, eastern Nigeria was transformed. The British had lost control of the roads, the courts, the villages. All that remained was their fear and their guns. But the women, though unarmed, had won something greater. They had forced the world to see them. They had shaken the empire itself. The fires of our bar were not just flames in the market. They were flames in the soul of a people, proof that even those dismissed as powerless could rise and challenge the greatest empire on earth. And though bullets would cut them down, their voices would echo across generations. What happens when mothers become warriors? When the hands that plant seeds and carry children refuse to bow? In December 1929, the world found its answer, and it came at a terrible cost. The British colonial administration was shaken to its core. District officers described the events not as protests, but as a revolt. For the empire, this was rebellion, and rebellions were met with force. Soldiers armed with Lee Enfield rifles and machine guns were dispatched to towns across eastern Nigeria. In their minds, they were facing an uprising that threatened imperial control. But what stood before them were not warriors with spears or muskets. They were women with bare hands, palm fronds, and songs. At Opobo, women surrounded the district office, singing in unison. When troops arrived, they fired into the air, hoping to scatter the crowd. But the women advanced, clapping, mocking, refusing to leave. One eyewitness said, "It was as if bullets were nothing to them. They came forward, dancing, and shouting, 'Shoot us if you can.'" The soldiers obeyed. Gunfire erupted. Bodies fell. Yet the women's defiance only grew louder. At Utu Etimekpo, hundreds were killed as machine guns tore through the crowd. At Aba, Umuahia, and Owerri, the story repeated itself. The empire unleashed bullets upon unarmed women, and history recorded the shame. By the time the uprising was crushed in January 1930, the toll was staggering. Over 50 native courts burned. Dozens of prisons attacked. Colonial offices shut down. And most tragically, more than 50 women killed, and over 50 others wounded. But beyond the numbers were the stories. Mothers who died with infants on their backs. Elderly women who marched despite frailty. Young girls who stood in front of soldiers and refused to bow. The blood of these women became a silent testimony written into the soil of Igboland. The British government in London was horrified when reports reached them. Newspapers carried headlines. Women in revolt. Massacre in Nigeria. Questions filled the House of Commons. Why had the colonial government fired on unarmed women? Why was taxation attempted without consent? The empire, unshaken by wars with men, now stood humiliated by its slaughter of women. A colonial officer admitted bitterly, "We did not face an army, yet they fought us with greater discipline than any regiment." In the aftermath, commissions of inquiry were held. The findings were undeniable. The warrant chief system was corrupt and oppressive. Women's voices had been excluded from governance. Taxation was unjust and dangerous. Slowly, changes came. The colonial administration abandoned plans to tax women. The power of warrant chiefs was curtailed. And the importance of women's councils, long ignored, was acknowledged once again. The empire had been forced to listen, not by guns, but by courage. The women's war was more than a protest. It was a revolution of dignity. It showed that resistance does not always need weapons. That even the seemingly powerless, the market women, the mothers, the grandmothers, could shake the pillars of empire. They called it a riot. But history remembers it as war, the women's war. For it was not chaos, but courage. Not disorder, but defiance. And though the empire's bullets silenced many voices, their echo carried forward, inspiring generations yet unborn. The Women's War of 1929 remains one of the first major anti-colonial uprisings in Africa led entirely by women. It was a cry for justice, equality, and recognition. Its lesson endures. When the oppressed rise in unity, even empires tremble. The guns fell silent in 1930, but the spirit of the Women's War did not die. Instead, it became a seed, planted deep in the soil of Africa, growing into movements that would challenge not only colonial rule, but every injustice that followed. In the villages of Aba, Owerri, and Opobo, the women buried their dead, but not their voices. Stories of courage were passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to child. We stood together once, and the empire shook. By the 1940s, when railway workers went on strike in Nigeria, when students raised their voices in protest, when peasants rejected unfair taxes, many looked back to 1929 and remembered, resistance was possible. The Women's War was no longer a single event. It became a symbol of collective defiance. Some of the women who survived the clashes continued to play roles in politics and trade networks. They inspired later women leaders like Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who in the 1940s and 1950s led Igbo women against colonial taxation, and later became a voice in Nigeria's independence struggle. This legacy of female leadership was not an accident. It was a continuation of a tradition: Igbo women's assemblies, Yoruba women's market councils, Tiv women's dances, all of which had been silenced by colonial structures but revived through resistance. The colonial government, deeply shaken, made adjustments. The warrant chief system was restructured. Women were given recognition in local governance. Future policies were more cautious, fearing another uprising. But the greatest change was psychological. The empire learned that African women could not be ignored. By the mid-20th century, Nigeria was stirring with nationalist movements. Men like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo carried the banner of independence, but behind them, market women, traders, and mothers kept the grassroots alive. The Women's War stood as an early warning to colonialism. The people of Nigeria would not bow forever. It foreshadowed the independence of 1960 and echoed in every rally, strike, and campaign that led there. Today, scholars call the Women's War of 1929 one of the first major anti-colonial revolts in Africa led entirely by women. It is studied not just in Nigerian history, but in global feminist and anti-colonial movements. It reminds us that resistance does not always begin with generals or soldiers. Sometimes it begins with women in a marketplace, with a song, with a refusal to bow. The questions the women asked in 1929 still echo today. Who holds power, and how do they use it? How are women's voices represented in leadership? How do ordinary people resist injustice without weapons? In an age where protests continue around the world, against inequality, corruption, and oppression, the Women's War stands as a blueprint for courage. The empire called it a riot, but history remembers it as war. A war without guns, led by the voices of women, carried by the strength of mothers, sealed in the blood of martyrs. The Women's War was not the end of oppression, but it was the beginning of awakening. And that awakening would one day set a nation free.